Our first talk of the day is Ryan Lockard.
Let's give him a warm welcome.
Hello. You all can hear me, right? Yes. Cool. So my talk is really, we're going to be talking about the concept of SRE, Site Reliability Engineering. It's not a new concept, but I want to talk about it through the context of the enterprise, right? And that adds some elements to it. So, right. I work for a company, and this is really to help set that context. What I'm going to go through, it may seem like we're talking about theory, but this is actually things that we've applied over and over again. Basically, I work for Contino. We are a cloud and DevOps consultancy. We specifically target large, heavily regulated enterprises. So like 60% of our work comes through financial institutions, like my personal mortgage company, my personal credit card company, are both customers. We do a lot with telco. We do some with healthcare and other industries. But the reason that matters is because to make the type of change that we're going to talk about throughout the entire course of today and tomorrow is difficult. Doing that under the watchful eye of the compliance elements and the regulators is another that's another vector entirely. We get to work pretty closely with AWS, with GCP, with Azure. We're certified by CNCF for our work with Kubernetes. Okay, so all the slides that I'm going to go through are going to be tweeted, and there's actually some links that I'm going to throw up here. They're also going to be tweeted, so don't feel like you have to write anything down or take the washed out pictures off the screen. I'm not looking for a shameless follow. You do not have to follow me, but if you want the slides, if you want the links, you can catch them at _Lockard. Okay. Today, really what I want to do is give you I want to talk about what operating in the cloud means when we talk about reliability, when we talk about telemetry, instrumentation, and things like that, and why it's different than the traditional estate. It is different. We also want to talk about practical steps that you can take to start adopting the practice of site reliability engineering in the enterprise context. And I keep saying the word enterprise. How many people here actually work in what they'd consider an enterprise situation? Cool, so you know the pain that I'm talking about. And let's just roll it back for a second. I spent 17 years in the enterprise. I didn't do consulting before I came to Contino. I've only been doing this thing for about 2.5, 3 years. Before that, it was 17 years in the enterprise. So I come with a high degree of empathy for the organizational construct that kind of keeps some of these concepts down. And actually, let's roll back even further. So when I was a kid, growing up, I loved baseball. Even today, I love baseball. I'm from Philly. You're going to hear that probably in my voice. And I'm not going to talk about the Eagles. I'm probably not going to talk about the Phillies. But damn it, the Flyers are going to do something this year. But when I was a kid, I actually was pretty good at baseball. And I always joke with my boss that when I get fed up with these enterprises, when I get fed up with technology, I still think I could eke out a minor league baseball career. He points out the pay cut that I'd have to take. But when I was a kid, it was probably around 92, 93. I was actually doing really well. I was getting on some pretty good travel teams and things of that nature. And I was known as a contact hitter, so I wasn't hitting a load of home runs. I was really just a see-ball, hit-ball type guy. And what was really cool was, even when I didn't get a hit, I saw a lot of pitches, which would help my teammates and would help my coach understand what the other pitcher had in his arsenal. I also really loved watching the game. And there was this guy called Gary Sheffield. If you're a baseball fan and you're roughly my age, you probably know who Gary Sheffield is. I just loved the way that guy played the game. He was a hustle guy. He had attitude. He could hit the ball. And he was a contact hitter, but he hit for power too. And I was just a regular kid in the suburbs. So when I would stand, my batting stance was pretty normal. I started watching Gary Sheffield. And he started off in San Diego, I think. Then he did a pretty long clip in Florida. I did some time here in Detroit, and then all things that he washed up in New York. So, Philly. But the thing with Gary Sheffield is, when he would stand, right before the pitch came in, he would dip the bat down like this, and he got really low, not Jeff Bagwell low, but he would get low and dip the bat, and then he would connect and hit for power. So, I remember watching and emulating him as a kid, 13, 14 years old. And my next game, I'm like, I'm going to bat like Gary Sheffield. I'm going to go from a contact hitter to a power hitter. I went up there 3 pitches later after doing this ridiculous imitation of Gary Sheffield. I walked back to the bench, and there's this look on my coach's face. It's like, disappointment isn't the word. Bewilderment, that's a good one, and just like despair. And he just looked at me and said, don't ever, ever do that again. So I go to the bench, and I started to think about it, and I'm like, but Gary Sheffield does it, and he hits for power. What the hell? So that sort of is the impetus for this talk, right? A lot of people, when they think about SRE, they think about the Google book, the Google SRE book. If I read that book, I can take that and apply that in my work. All you're doing is you're going to take that bat, you're going to dip it down and swing and miss. So how can we take what is proven to be a good set of practices and principles and apply them in our context? That is what this talk sort of stemmed from. All of these organizations just trying to do SRE without understanding the why behind the what. So hopefully we're going to talk through a couple different concepts today that help first identify the problem state and then work towards a better solution state. So Tonya Riley is the program manager for Google SRE. She's amazingly smart. She talks about when an incident arises, when a bug arises, when something outside of the predicted state happens, we should embrace that. We should fall in love with that. There's a white paper that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, where in it I talk about falling in love with your incidents. That allows you to build a harder system, a more resilient system. So if you're familiar, Tonya's actually one of the authors of that Google book. You should thank people that find those issues for you, by the way. And she says that in that quote. They help you build a harder system when they come to you with an incident. You learn more about your system. So this is the book. Has anyone read this one? All 475 pages. I think it's freely available now on the Google SRE page. There's 2 reasons why I don't think this book applies like by the letter to your workspace. It definitely doesn't apply to the workspaces that I work with. One reason, the average Google salary is orders of magnitude higher than what most enterprises pay. So it's a bell curve, which means it's really smart, right? But most engineers in the enterprise are not getting compensated at the same level that the Google SREs are getting compensated at. They're also usually cherry picking the top 2% out of places like Stanford to fill these roles and across the world. Second reason that you probably cannot apply the Google SRE concepts directly to your company. Sorry, there's a delay on my clicker. Google owns 100% of the software that they write. Beyond that, they specially design hardware, so they own the hardware that runs the software that they own. If I say COTS, commercial off-the-shelf software, people know what that is. Every single enterprise, every single company, I've worked in smaller companies in the past as well. Every single company I work with has, best case scenario, 60% of their software is COTS. 40% is bespoke, right? We do not own the software that we work with. We do not own the operating system. We do not own the patches. We oftentimes do not own the software itself. What we're doing is we're gluing together a bunch of disparate systems, but at the end of the day, if you're an engineer, if you're a frontline engineer, your phone still rings when that system goes down at 3 in the morning. So you don't have to believe me yet, but you probably don't work for Google. So the concepts are still good. I'm not disparaging the book. I'm not disparaging the principles in the book. What I'm saying is we have to take them and we have to realize the context for which they were written and applied are not exactly a one-for-one parody for the way that we work. So, like all things, actually, I don't write that much. I try to force myself to write more, and I'm just not that person. But last year, myself and a colleague, Skylar Bishop, we wrote, or it might have been this year. And consulting years go much faster, so like 1 year is 7 years. But we wrote a white paper about reliability engineering for the enterprise. And we really talk about creating antifragile systems, which is the Talib wrote a book called Antifragile, which in the human language, it's really hard to have a word that is the opposite of fragile. So we work with a lot of fragile systems. That's why we don't release that often in a lot of enterprises. So how do you talk about the opposite of fragile? Rigid is one word, but that doesn't sound like something I want to build. So we'll just call it anti-fragile. This white paper, it's a free download, but a lot of the concepts that are in it are in this talk today. So I worked with my marketing team to actually create an SRE cheat sheet. We have a lot of engagements around the world right now that are helping to build up the SRE practice within organizations. They've done the cloud journey, and they're going through the cloud journey, and they're realizing, oh shit, we can't just use the same support systems that we used when we were running everything on-prem, the same as we're running in the cloud. So we came up with a pretty quick and easy and dirty cheat sheet, anonymized it, so if you're interested, it's available as well. Again, the links are going to be shot out probably at 9:45 if my marketing stuff does its job. So the monitoring landscape, it's completely different now than it was when we ran a lot of workloads on-prem. I saw AppDynamics is out in the Expo Center. There are plenty of tools available, but the way that we use those tools have to be applied differently. I work on basically all three major public clouds. We use on-prem, we use private cloud and everything. And a lot of the times you have to come up with brand new operating models so that telemetry is treated as a first-class citizen. It's really hard to put telemetry in after the fact. You have to know the intent of the system that you're designing and the business logic that we're actually trying to instrument for. It's not just a ping. If my service is up, it doesn't mean it's doing what it's supposed to. So what we need to do is we need to be worried about additional things. We need to be worried about the cloud. We need to be worried about the shared responsibility model. Why do we have to worry about that? Because there are things we don't have to worry about anymore. We should be leveraging cloud native services and things of that nature. So let's talk about the reliability landscape challenges. First and foremost, we're creating some significantly complex systems. Andy Vance Lars will be doing a talk today about simplicity, so I'm really, really putting a fork in his side today by saying that we're building some complex systems. Microservices are eating the world. I think a lot of people talk about microservices, but it's like everyone says they're doing it, but nobody actually is. Event-driven architectures are really starting to take over the world too. They're adding a layer of complexity that we've never seen before. Cloud native services, they're changing the context in which things are created, in which how we invoke services. And then of course hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. Free bit of advice, if you're ever working with a boss and he says we can't go to AWS or we can't go to Azure, we need to avoid vendor lock-in, we need multi-cloud out the gate, realize that person does not want to go to the cloud. Incidents. I love incidents personally because it tells me how my system's behaving, it tells me how my users are using my system. But the reality is, we need to be aware of those, and they are going to create some new problems because we're going to see different instantiations of issues that we've never seen before because of the context shift. And then ultimately, the talent gap. I was having a conversation with Rex last night at dinner, and he said, Ryan, have you ever walked into a customer as a consultant where you go in and you do an assessment or you do like some discovery and you figure out they know exactly what they need to do? And you as a consultant can't tell them something better than they already know. And up until this year, I would have said no, but this year I've actually had that happen twice, where I walk in and they have the exact right mindset, or at least 80% of the way. They know what they need to do. That doesn't mean they know how to do it, right? So a lot of this stuff that Contino does, and I'm saying this not because I'm selling to anybody in this room, I promise I'm not. I believe this is the way that we as a species learn. We do a lot of pair programming. So we sit shoulder to shoulder and we actually show people the why behind the what while actually executing the what. So when we build out microservices, when we build out new application code and we start with test-driven development, we explain to them why this stuff matters. It allows you to go faster. That raises the capability level within the organization. The worst thing for me is if I ever hear that Contino did a job with a client for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, we left, and the minute we left, everything reverted to the way it was before. I like to create sticky capabilities, and the best way I know how to do that with engineering is through pair programming. And I'll be honest with you, I pair manage, so a lot of times the engineering level understands the right things to do, and they even understand some of the concepts and the capabilities, but you have oppressive organizations and legacy command and control managers that literally got to where they were through command and control managements. They believe that the past will dictate future, and they've been successful with that model. So a lot of times the pairing doesn't stop at the IDE. It actually works all the way up to the CIO level, which honestly happens with me today. Like, I'll be talking to a CIO later today just to talk about what did he learn in the last week. So, talk about some issues. What actually is SRE? SRE is when you ask a software developer to look at the operations function. Again, I'm ripping off a Google guy after I said Google doesn't apply to you. The principles do. So let's take a quick look at tooling. I've done a couple DevOps Days talks in the past, and I remember one of them was really just around tooling, and tools are fundamental to do our job, but they are commodities, right? You can take the best tools in the world. Like AWS is a powerful tool, but if you run everything in S3 and EC2, you are not maximizing the potential of that tool. Same thing is true for everything. I love Kubernetes. I think if you want to roll Kubernetes yourself as your very first container orchestrator from the ground up, you need your goddamn head examined. There are easier ways to get from A to B. New Relic, AppD, Sonatype, Jenkins, they're all tools, and they all are being used appropriately and inappropriately. But what we need to do is understand what it is we're paying for, what our intent is, and what our actual outcomes are based on these tools that we're going for. And tools are not static. They are part of a dynamic roadmap and a dynamic strategy that need to be continuously harmonized and looked at and reviewed, and making sure that our teams are using them the right way. I'm still pointing at the TV, guys. All right, so let's talk about a generic customer and what their SRE roadblocks sort of look like. And this is something that I see pretty regularly, and hopefully you can read this in the back. If I got $1 for every time someone told me they wanted faster, better, cheaper, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be talking about going to minor league baseball either. But they also say they want to invest in the future, right? Especially now. If you work for a big enterprise, what are we in? October. So somewhere around August and September, they build their 2020 vision and their 2020 roadmap and their 2020 budget. So I know right now what my spend is going to be in the third week of December 2020, right? But they want to talk about getting to faster, better, cheaper, and investing in the future. When I say HIPPO, that means highest paid person in the office. So that person's opinion is obviously the most important. They get the biggest bank account. And they like to, a lot of times those folks are legacy managers, those command and control managers, and they want to trust their gut feel. They know what needs to be instrumented. They know what needs to be hardened just because they know. They have the highest paycheck, so therefore their vote counts more. Phoenix Project, Brent, when we talk about that, I assume everyone in this room at least has heard about it, if not read it. There are people that genuinely know what telemetry is and genuinely know what needs to be instrumented. But what they aren't able to do is get to the damn work because they're putting out all the fires. That's actually an anti-pattern. That's not a good thing. We also have misaligned release teams that are operating in silos, and they're not sharing their release patterns. They're not going back to standardized systems that are actually allowing for us to not have to repave the road every time. Experiments, unknowns that are out there, the dangers and the pitfalls, especially when you talk about the cloud journey. Bad data, when I can't even tell you how many times I've had bad releases go through because the data condition didn't exist in the lowers. So bad data is definitely causing issues. And the skill gap. So ultimately, what we're looking for is patterns. We're looking for automation. We're looking for using the right data. A lot of times I talk to clients about synthetic data so that we're able to recreate data ephemerally, ephemeral environments and things of that nature. So what happens today is we have all these teams rowing towards an end goal, and they're doing it under the guise of a team, but everybody's operating independently. At some point, hopefully in smaller increments than what we typically are doing, we hit a button. Because CD is, like we all say CI/CD, it rolls off the tongue really easy. CI/CD, CI/CD. Who actually does continuous deployment? I mean, continuous deployment to the lowers, yeah, that happens a lot. But continuous deployment to production, there's still somebody that has to get approval from some CCB or some manager that's never written a line of code in their life to push a button to go to production. Unfortunately, that's the reality of release management these days. But let's talk about what principles and practices we can start pulling down from the SRE concepts and applying to our teams today. First and foremost, everybody sitting in this room right now is already doing the first principle, continuous learning. Just your subscription to be here today, you voted that this day is more valuable spent in this community, talking and learning, than doing anything else right now. So that's amazing. And I will second what the guys were talking about earlier. Those Ignite talks, and then of course the breakouts in the afternoon, not the breakouts, the open spaces. Hands down, that is some of the best learning I've ever had in my career, are open spaces at these types of conferences. Those roundtable talks that will happen and emerge are freaking amazing. There's nothing like that in the industry. I'm not gonna have enough time today. I actually don't have a clock. Oh, I do have a clock. I'm not gonna have enough time today to really get into the business objectives bit, but there are zero CIOs, COOs, or CFOs that care about cloud, Kubernetes, or any of those things. They really don't. They care about the outcomes that they derive, the business value that you get from using those tools. One thing that as technologists that we really hinder ourselves with is we allow ourselves to become a cost center because we cannot speak in the business context. We need to learn how these behaviors that we're going through and how the right thing actually, the right thing technically actually begets the right thing from a business sense. Creating business strategy and attaching that to OKRs. We're not gonna have time to go through that today, but it definitely, if you understand the objectives and key results framework, using that to attach it to business objectives so that your key results then can be technical things that we're implementing to reach those business outcomes. Relentlessly chasing automation and self-healing. The best incident is the incident that heals itself. I still want to know that that happened because I know where the bullets are in the armor, but the armor stopped it. So let's create more rigidity and let's learn from those incidents. And that sort of speaks to the very first practice. Measure everything. I know that that's like impossible, but if you're thinking, hey, should I actually create a log for this? Should I be doing something around this? The answer is yes. And then if it seems to be noisy, chattery, or invaluable, we can scrub that later. But you don't know that yet. Test all the things. If the same concept applies, should I write a test for this? Yes. You should always write a test for this. And as developers, it is our responsibility to write tests too. The QA team has responsibilities, but if you're writing a new function, you should be writing new unit tests as well. Instrumentation across the board. Error budget. We're not actually, I don't talk that much about error budget in this talk. When I create dashboards with clients, when we start showing the graphical view of the telemetry, error budget is one of the things that we highlight specifically. I actually work with a customer right now, and if you've seen Monty Python, they really claw back to Monty Python. In Slack, they talk about bring out your debt, bring out your debt. And all they're doing is they're trying to draw forward and expose the error budget that they're starting to get closer and closer to. And if I talk about you build it, you own it, hopefully you guys know what that means. But we're trying to create empathy in the system so that the developer that writes the code, you don't kick it over the wall and then say, let support deal with it if it doesn't work. A lot of organizations are actually shifting towards if you write the code, you get the call at 3 a.m. It doesn't go to level 1, level 2, level 3, it goes to you. So how do we actually do this? First thing we need to do is start somewhere. If you think about what I said with the multi-cloud, is the manager that doesn't want to go to the cloud, you have to start doing something. So first thing that I like to do is align everybody on what the problem statement is and what it is we're trying to actually achieve. Build a very lightweight plan, and then do something that we can prove. We call those lighthouse projects. That's why you see the lighthouse there. And from there, we can talk about scale, and we can talk about improvement katas and things like that. But this first chunk, I like to set parameters of 2 to 3 months. I want to start showing return in 2 to 3 months inside the walls of one of the largest banks in the world. And that's exactly what we did. We'll just say within the top 4 banks in the world, we've done this exact same thing, and it's sending them down this very large scaling journey. So when I talk about a lighthouse project, let me quickly define what a good lighthouse project looks like. We need to have engineering and product buy-in. Without that, you're building on a foundation of sand. We also need leadership to support it in some form or fashion. Blameless postmortems. Everybody talks about blameless postmortems. A lot of times you don't get blameless on the first, second, third try, but you iterate towards blameless more and more, and that way you can start really truly falling in love with those incidents. A propensity towards telemetry, and then ultimately, my best day at a client is when we've automated Contino out of a job. So once we hit a scaling factor, then what happens? That's when we really start hitting the gas on automation. We already have proven concepts in practice that work in the first lighthouse, the second lighthouse. So now let's start calcifying those as automated practices within the next iteration. I'm not a big fan of the term community of practice. I just don't have a better one, so I'm forced to use it. But a lot of times we start building out SRE communities of practice within that organization. I've heard of Hive as a really cool model. Like you have a Hive and they go out and do work and then come back to the Hive and contribute. But you're starting to build out those enterprise-grade patterns and those enterprise-grade systems that are reusable assets, digital assets, that continue to pay down previous organizational and technical debt. And then, I've worked for a CIO that I thought had Tourette's, how much he talked about AI. He would say AI, ML, about everything. Once we have hit a point of scale where we have hard automation going, we can then start building in defensive mechanisms. We can start building in AI assets and things like that so that our systems are actually self-learning. You don't start there, you end there. So let's talk about how we apply these things. I sort of club together a couple active engagements I have, and I talk about what we're actually doing in those clients to bring SRE practices to life inside the walls of some of the largest, most heavily regulated companies in the world. First and foremost, we hear about SLIs, SLOs, SLAs, and there are very formal definitions of them. I prefer to go with Charity Majors. She has a very simple definition of each. An SLI is the measure of goodness that you have within your team. So uptime, downtime, things of that nature. Your SLO is an agreement between the IT and the business of how often you can afford to fail your SLI. And then ultimately, your SLA is the agreement with the business users. With your actual users. And one of the organizations I'm working with right now, when I say user, I'm not talking about the consumer market. They are internal service. So we've created SRE around internal services inside of a very large financial institution. So their customers are actually application teams within that same institution. Their product is services. You actually have to really apply the project to product mindset shift, and you really have to understand that everything I build has a customer. So this is another view of the same thing. You can take that very simple previous slide and make it a little more complex. I promise I can make it more complex than this, but for the sake of today, we'll leave it here. Really what we're looking at is we're going for a left to right read here, so reverse your thinking. And we start with SLIs at the engineering tier. As we get closer to an SLA, that's when we're talking more directly to our business, be that external or internal. So this is true, well, mostly true. Some of it is scrubbed and genericized, but this is an actual readout that I gave to a customer this quarter about where we are on their SRE journey. The very first thing is there was no understanding of who their customer was. Think about how dangerous that is for a second. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here, but if you work in the internal services, if you're providing an internal service, do you think of your users as your customer inside the walls of your organization? I was talking to, if you're an Agile practitioner, there's the Agile Manifesto, 17 all-white dudes wrote that thing. But one of them is a guy named John Kern. He lives about 20 miles from me, and he and I meet up pretty regularly for beers, and I use him as a mentor. And I asked him, what got you into that group? What got you into that mindset? And he told me that he worked on government project time and time again. And I'm like, okay. He's like, there was wild spending. I created documentation for no reason, and we never actually released anything. And I remember him looking at me and saying, I am a customer of my own product when I work for the government, and so are you. Our taxes fund those projects. So that level of awareness to who my customer is needs to be applied into the internal services teams as well. So this team specifically, sorry, went off on a tangent. This team specifically, they did not have any interaction with the people that use the services that they create. Wildly dangerous. They also had no measure of SLOs. They didn't even understand SLOs, to be honest with you. So what we did is we actually agreed on them. We set SLOs and we created an actual dashboard that showed how close we were getting to breach those SLOs. For the App Dynamics guys, we actually used App Dynamics. They also started with 0 code coverage. Now, code coverage to me is it's a little bit of a vanity metric. I can get 100% code coverage in about 3 days on a very complex application. It's very simple. But this is we started doing test-driven development with these folks, and we started showing them the importance of a test harness around their code, and they got closer and closer, and they're about 70% now. Actually, it's going up. I got a Slack message yesterday saying that they measured again, and it's going up more. Root cause analysis. The interesting thing here is 90% of things that were tagged as a P1, I think it was for the last 2 years, is how far we went back. 90% of the P1s were not P1s. Think about the noise in the system that creates. The only way that I get my thing fixed is if I call it a P1. So everybody drops everything to fix a P1 until everything's a P1. When everything's a number one priority, nothing's a priority. So what we did is we went through, we figured out through the root cause analysis what the actual true P1 cycle was and helped draw that down. 30% of those were actually repeated issues. So we actually built out a backlog and we started fixing those P1 issues, those true P1s, and made sure that they would not repeat themselves. And we continued to draw down against that. And then ultimately within the application operations, 90% of the time, this team was working on BAU. They were just keeping the lights on in the shop. They weren't doing anything innovative. They weren't advancing the platform. They weren't advancing the system. So what we did is we started measuring that, right? We created a CI pipeline, and we moved a lot of the application operation work into the pipeline itself. We started teaching the team how to extend that pipeline so that they can onboard more, and they could make it more robust. We ultimately reduced toil because we were measuring the toil by 30%. So that's pretty much it for me, but I just want to go back to my buddy Gary Sheffield. Later in my illustrious baseball career, I got to talk to a real hitting coach, and I told him that story, and the same look of bewilderment that hit my coach at the time came over his face, and I told him, he's like, you idiot. It had nothing to do with the way he was dipping his bat. That was just a timing metric. That's how he geared his body up to tense up for the hit. All of his power came from his hips. He was shifting from back to front. Had you just done that simple tweak and applied his position to your context, you probably would have been getting more doubles and home runs than you were singles. So that's my talk. Everything should be tweeted out right now. _Lockard. If you want the slides, if you want either of those downloads, they're freely available. So thank you.